Hello, welcome to another episode of Critical Weight Theory. So, for years, public conversations about cannabis have bounced between two extremes, at least in a lot of cases. On one side, you've got decades of prohibition era fear campaigns that painted marijuana as a social menace. On the other, legalization and commercialization helped create a new narrative. Cannabis as a natural, mostly harmless lifestyle product, maybe even in some cases a miracle cure or something like that. Sometimes people treat it as if it's like the greatest thing ever. And emerging research suggests reality may be more complicated than either side wants to admit. And yes, this is a bit of a weird place to be because, on the one hand, I don't want to feed the narrative that, pot is a scary, scary thing or something like that. But at the same time, maybe it's not something we should treat like it's a deity or something and about to create world peace or whatever. So, a recent review led by researchers at the University of Toulouse analyzed 24 major studies involving roughly 200 million people, and their findings, published in the journal Heart, found a consistent association between cannabis use and cardiovascular harm. So, according to the meta analysis, cannabis users showed a 29% higher risk of acute coronary syndrome, a 20% higher risk of stroke, and roughly double the risk of death from cardiovascular disease. So, that doesn't sound too good, right? And most of the people studied were between 19 and 59 years old, and cannabis users, what the hell? Cannabis users in the data sets also tended to be younger and more often male. The researchers argue that this issue has become increasingly urgent because cannabis use has expanded rapidly over the past decade, especially in places where legalization and commercialization normalized high potency products. So, before anybody jumps to conclusions, though, there is an important distinction here. This study does not prove cannabis directly causes heart attacks or strokes. Most of the evidence reviewed was observational. Researchers tracked patterns across existing populations rather than conducting controlled clinical experiments. That means they can identify correlations, but they cannot fully isolate cause and effect. The paper itself acknowledged some significant limitations. Some studies lacked detailed information about how much cannabis people consumed, how often they used it, or whether they smoked, vaped, or used edibles. And several data sets also overlapped with one another, raising concerns about duplication and statistical bias. And those limitations matter. They should be taken into account because if we're being intellectually honest, skepticism has to go in more than one direction. Governments have a long history of exaggerating drug dangers to justify policing and incarceration and social control. And yes, that includes some racism and stuff like that. If you look into the history of the drug war, that has long been a part of, well, you could say it's always been a part of it. At the same time, modern cannabis industries increasingly resemble other profit driven industries that minimize health risks while encouraging heavy consumption. A critical reading of this research means rejecting both moral panic and corporate reassurance. And, a little bit of the pothead culture that treats, marijuana as if it's something that almost gives meaning to life itself. And I suppose for some people, maybe it does. But I guess this episode isn't really for those people who are so enamored with smoking the Mary Jane that they can't even tolerate a little bit of critique or a little bit of rainy day on their pot parade. So, one major question is whether the cardiovascular danger comes primarily from cannabis itself or from inhaling some smoke. And researchers from the National Institute of Health, or National Institutes of Health, I guess it's more than one. But anyway, they have pointed out that burning cannabis releases many of these same toxins found in tobacco smoke, including carbon monoxide, fine particulates, and chemicals that stress the cardiovascular system. And you get a little bit of hint of that just from the fact that people who smoke pot often cough, just the way that regular smokers might. So the idea that it's completely without any sort of negative health consequences, I would call that into question just based on the fact that you kind of smoke and you get like a cough from it. Of course, you could also cough if you're eating food and under many normal circumstances. So, you might want to shrug your shoulders at that sometimes anyway. But it's usually not a good sign. And NIH report on cannabis smoking and cardiovascular risk. It. I don't know if it carries the same weight as your anecdotal experience. Um, maybe you're one of those types who just doesn't believe what the official scientific verdict would have to say about something. And I guess that's on you if that's how you feel about it. Some of the studies in the review adjusted for tobacco use. Others could not fully separate cannabis related harms from smoking related harms. And that distinction becomes important because most cannabis users in the analyzed populations likely did consume it by smoking. Still, the uncertainty cuts both ways. Not every study has found the same level of danger. A later study involving older U.S. veterans with existing coronary artery, or let me try that again, existing coronary artery disease. It's like a tongue twister for me. But anyway, that study did not find a statistically significant increase in heart attacks or strokes among cannabis users after adjusting for other health factors. And that doesn't erase the earlier findings, but it does suggest the science is still evolving, and that risk may depend heavily on age, dosage, frequency, method of consumption, and underlying health conditions. I mean, that's one of the things here. Like, when it comes to underlying health conditions, that's a pretty significant variable in just about any sort of scientific study, because what impacts one person negatively might not be the same across the general population. Uh, then that's pretty much true across the board with practically any study. You know, I guess it would depend on the extreme nature of the study and what sort of health risk is being studied. Like, one thing might be more harmful than another, of course, but it's just a rule of thumb that the underlying health conditions are a very significant variable. And what does seem increasingly difficult to defend is the idea that cannabis is biologically harmless. Recent studies suggest that younger users, especially adults under 50, may face elevated cardiovascular risks, even without traditional factors like high blood pressure or tobacco use. And some researchers now estimate that younger cannabis users may be several times more likely to experience heart attacks or ischemic strokes compared to non users. Daily use has also been associated with increased rates of coronary artery disease. There we go, I said it right this time. So, scientists are still debating the mechanisms behind these effects, and possible explanations include increases in heart rate and blood pressure, inflammation of blood vessels, arterial spasms, and changes in platelet activity that could contribute to clot formation. Now, I'm no medical expert. I barely even know what all that stuff means, to be honest. You know, um, but nevertheless, there's disagreement on exactly what the main factors are. And while smoking remains the most common method of use, researchers increasingly suspect that edibles and high potency concentrates may carry risks of their own. So, additional raining on your pop parade, get out that umbrella. And the problem is that the data still contain major gaps. Many studies rely on self reported use, few can precisely measure dose or potency, and researchers still don't fully understand how long term exposure interacts with genetics, age, or those pesky pre existing conditions. So, public discussion around cannabis has often demanded certainty where none actually truly exists. Either cannabis is a dangerous gateway drug or it's a completely safe plant medicine and a healer of the world. Some people maintain that if everybody just sat around and smoked a bong, like there'd be world peace. And it's a nice thought, but I don't know if that's true either. And either prohibition was justified or every warning today must be dismissed as propaganda. That's one of the the false dichotomies that we're presented with here. So the evidence points somewhere less convenient, somewhere in the middle, some sort of weird Goldilocks zone, if you will. And cannabis may carry real cardiovascular risks, especially for younger users, heavy users, and people already vulnerable to heart disease. At the same time, the science remains incomplete, and many important questions are still unresolved. Researchers are increasingly calling for cannabis to be treated more like tobacco from a public health perspective, including clearer warning labels, and more transparent education about cardiovascular risks. Not because cannabis is uniquely evil, but because honest public health requires something more difficult than fear campaigns or marketing slogans. It requires an acknowledge of some uncertainty, some nuance, and the willingness to follow evidence even when it complicates the story that people want to hear. All right, so hopefully you enjoyed this episode. Maybe you learned something. I don't know. Um, I don't particularly, get that involved in pot smokage, but I definitely know people who do smoke it. Just like I know people who drink and who have done other substances that are under the drug category. And I'm not exactly anti-drug, but I'm not really pro-drug either. There's like that there are different things to consider when it comes to all that kind of stuff. But anyway, maybe you're immersed in drug culture. Maybe it's like your way of life or something. But it's not my way of life. I'll just put it like that. And I'm trying not to be judgmental here. I'm just stating a fact. I'm sure some people are like they're a little bit defensive of it. They see marijuana as like a sacred thing or like it's the greatest thing since sliced bread or whatever. But I'm just saying, it's a little bit in the middle. It's not all good, not all bad. Anyway, have a good day.